I wonder with you this morning, what's different this time? He's swarmed by people constantly. What's different this time? How many times has he retreated to solitude or pressed through the crowds to get to another meeting or destination? He always seems like he's on a mission, and adoring fans of zillions of followers clamoring for his latest tweets, they don't really faze him. But this time he sees the crowd larger than ever before, and he stops. He sets up camp. He has compassion for them. He heals the sick. He spends hours with them into the evening. What's different this time? Even his disciples know the time has come to move on, to get back onto the water and cut across the Sea of Galilee to their next stop before it's too dark, or maybe they sense the emotional tumults in the sea of humanity that was before them. People who have journeyed from the cities, the scripture said, out into the countryside, trying to find Jesus, so preoccupied in their determination that they forget even food and water. The disciples know that people get hungry and tired, and that's an unhappy cocktail when stirred among a mass of people. Use your megaphone and disperse the crowd. They're saying to Jesus, we're in the middle of nowhere. Send them on their way so they can go buy food. And Jesus says no. And I keep wondering, what's different this time? Like we forget to do in real life, all we have to do is ask, or to research, to try to understand the reason behind the incongruencies of people's behaviors. And it seems to me that Jesus responds with prolonged care and profound presence in the midst of this sea of people, because they are wounded and angry and afraid. The preceding verses from what Amy read make plain what was happening on a macro level in the region. While each of these individuals were off at their jobs or in their fields or out on the sea fishing or in their homes, their narcissistic ruler was brazenly doing whatever he wanted. He was unconstrained by his advisors or even his family. He took what he wanted with no regard for the impact it had on others, and he learned this from his sociopathic father, who, according to the earlier chapters of Matthew's gospel, had ordered the murder of infant boys. That ruler was King Herod the Great, and this ruler is his son, referred to as Herod the Tetrarch, or Herod the ruler, who was entrusted with only a quarter of his father's empire. This was how Herod the ruler grew up, underneath and under King Herod the Great, and it showed in how he behaved as an adult, indulging everything he wanted, lacking empathy or accountability. Here are the verses before this miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. Beginning in verse 1 of the same chapter, at that time Herod the ruler, or Herod the Tetrarch, the son of Herod the Great, heard the news about Jesus. He said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He's been raised from the dead. This is why these miraculous powers are at work through him." Herod had arrested John, bound him, and put him in prison because of Herodias, the wife of Herod's brother, Philip. That's because John told Herod, it's against the law for you to marry her. And although Herod wanted to kill him, he feared the crowd because they thought John was a prophet. But at Herod's birthday party, Herodias' daughter danced in front of the guests and thrilled Herod. And he swore to give her anything she asked. At her mother's urging, the girl said, "Give me the head of John the Baptist here on a plate." Although the king was upset because of his solemn pledge and his guests, he commanded that they give it to her. Then he had John beheaded in prison. And they brought his head on a plate and gave it to the young woman, and she brought it to her mother. But John's disciples came and took his body and buried it. Then they went and told Jesus what had happened. And then the verses that Amy read begin. Herod the ruler's only emotions seem to be lust and fear. And still he acts with impunity in order to indulge his narcissism, his desires, his insecurities. It costs a good and decent person his life. And John wasn't the only one. As we heard, the word gets back to Jesus and he retreats into solitude as our reading picks up today. And surely he was mourning and angry, and he was probably overcome with a strong sense of foreboding. And it's here, when the people learn of this, that they pour out of the cities en masse to find Jesus. Maybe it's because they learned that Jesus was out in the countryside, or maybe they knew that part already, but when word got to them, when they learned of the news of John's execution, they were moved to action. Either way, this is the crowd Jesus discovers as he leaves this place of solitude, a crowd moved by the news of an unjust killing of an innocent man in federal custody. This is the crowd. These are the people for whom Jesus had compassion. Literally, the word means he suffered along with them. He healed their sick. But I think he listened to their anger. I think he sensed their fear. I think he heard their woundedness. And when evening came and their hearts were still rent open by Herod the puppet and the Roman Empire's systemic oppression and cruelty, Jesus was not ready to disperse the crowd. Where the disciples wanted to send them off to get food, because heaven knows that cocktail of hunger and exhaustion and anger mixed with the unpredictability of a crowd can only lead to trouble that might raise the attention of the authorities. But Jesus abided their trouble. Jesus inhabited their trouble. The act was both a descendant and a forebearer of the good and necessary trouble that justice demands. The disciples wanted the middle ground of salving wounds. They want no part of the necessary trouble that's required for stopping the source or system or puppets of oppression that cause the wounds to begin with. To that, Jesus said no. What's different this time? Jesus knew these protesters were angry and afraid and wounded because he was too. He was suffering alongside them, compassion, co-experiencing their trauma with them. What's different about this time? Jesus tells the disciples to fix it, to do something about it. He says, you give them something to eat. And we know the rest of the story. They had their excuses. We don't have enough food. Maybe we don't have enough money. Maybe they should go buy their own. It's too dangerous or too uncertain. There won't be any order if we embark on this uncharted territory. Who knows what other excuses they had. Evolutionary biologists have begun looking into the human capacity for compassion, for empathy. From infancy, they remind us we are dependent on others to survive, whereas most animals are able to walk or stand or at least stumble at birth. We are helpless for months upon months. Scientists speculate that this is because of our capacity for compassion, actually. That, as one hypothesis goes, we adapted to a form of infancy that necessitated the compassion of others for our own survival. As you look at various images of the parts of the brain and body that are activated when engaged in different thoughts or actions, the same part of the brain that's activated when we experience pain personally, like stubbing a toe, is activated when we see an image of someone else experiencing pain. They are experiencing the physical pain, but that same part of our own brain lights up. Similarly, the part of the brain that regulates anxiety or fear lights up as well. And yet, even more astoundingly, at the same time, the part of the brain that regulates nurturing and care also lights up. Another part of the body, the vagus nerve, it wanders, it's a long one that wanders throughout the body. It also illuminates striking medical and scientific observations for us. This nerve is activated, for instance, when we hear stories of distress, of suffering, when we hear stories of sadness, and even when we hear stories of inspiration. Scientists at Berkeley also discovered that the more pride people feel, the weaker the vagus nerve responds. This result tells us, the researchers conclude, that when we feel a strong vagus nerve response, we are feeling common humanity with many different groups. When we are encouraged to feel strong identification with just our own group and not others, the vagus nerve dims. It's pretty clear that Jesus is feeling common humanity with the many different people constituting that crowd. And he wants the disciples' spirits to activate, and if not, at least their vagus nerves. The food that they scrounge up was enough for Jesus to feed the masses. And if Jesus could multiply 2 fish into 10,000 meals, he didn't really need the fish to begin with. He could have made manna from heaven or caused fishing nets to overflow. No, the miracle here was not just that kid's lunch that we talked about in the moment of wonder and his offering it to those in need. And it's not just the multiplication of that lunch into a lavish smorgasbord. The miracle was that the disciples did something. That's what was different this time. Compared to other miracles Jesus performs, this is the one where the disciples are a part of it. They didn't run away and disavow Herod's actions from the safety of their homes. They didn't disapprove of some of his tweets or whatever the equivalent was back then. They got in the mix. They entered into the fray. They had to engage with people close enough to discover there was only one lunch between them all. That's a lot of faces and a lot of names and a lot of stories of anger and anguish and hope that they had to encounter in order to find that out. The disciples couldn't run away. We can't either. Many of us are asking, what's different this time? Pandemic deaths are skyrocketing. Not 5,000 men, but 155,000 lives and stories have perished in the US alone. Why is it disproportionately affecting Black and Hispanic people? Black Lives Matter protests against police brutality and systemic oppression continue while leaders try to disperse the crowds with their myriad excuses and conspiracy theories and tactics. When it came to the feeding of the 5,000 plus people, the difference that time was that the disciples were a part of the miracle. Their proximity to the people in the crowd compelled them to compassion, to suffer along with them, to strive to remedy the problem. Their souls were activated as much as their vagus nerves were. Look around, friends, at all that's happening, at all the people who are hurting and afraid and angry. What will be different this time? Will you pray with me?